Across Africa, something is forming that sounds explosive but is unfolding quietly. A reparations war, not of bullets, but of balance sheets, law, diplomacy, and narrative. For centuries, wealth flowed outward under empire, slavery, and extraction. That flow built industries, banks, and welfare states elsewhere. The world called it trade. History called it a conquest. The global system called it development. Now Africa is asking a different question. If the modern West accumulated advantage through centuries of structured extraction, is that advantage untouchable? Or is it negotiable? This is not a protest movement shouting into the wind. It is a continental recalibration, institutions aligning, legal arguments sharpening, alliances forming. The strategy is not to threaten. It is a corner logic, to make refusal more costly than engagement. The goal is simple and radical at once. Not to beg, not to punish, but to make the West pay willingly. So, what's really going on? Let's find out. There are cities in Europe whose wealth was never officially traced. Streets were paved in the 19th century. Banks were founded in the early industrial era. Insurance firms that grew quietly alongside maritime trade. Museums filled with artifacts whose journeys were never fully explained. The buildings stand calmly today, as if they rose from local soil alone. But infrastructure does not appear out of thin air. Capital has origin stories. In the late 1800s, as European empires formalized control over Africa during the Berlin Conference, maps were redrawn with astonishing confidence. No African leaders were present at that table, yet entire regions were assigned like commercial portfolios. What followed was not chaos. It was the administration. Railways were laid. Ports were expanded. Mining concessions were granted. Custom systems were engineered. But look closely at those railways. They did not connect African villages for local trade. They connected mines to ports, plantations to shipping routes, interior wealth to European markets. They were economic arteries, but the heart was elsewhere. The Congo Free State under King Leopold II generated enormous profits from rubber. West African cocoa and palm oil fueled European manufacturing. Gold mining intensified in southern Africa. Uranium from Niger would later power European nuclear grids. Cotton fed textile industries that shaped global trade dominance. These were not isolated transactions. They were structural transfers. And what makes structural transfers different from normal trade is design. Colonial systems were engineered to ensure that value multiplication occurred outside Africa. Raw materials exist. Finished goods returned at higher prices. Capital accumulation concentrated in imperial centers. Banking systems grew around that flow. When independence movements surged across Africa in the mid-20th century, flags changed, anthems changed, but economic infrastructure remained largely intact. Export patterns stayed narrow. Commodity dependence persisted. Trade asymmetries continued. Financial systems remained tied to former colonial powers. The question modern reparations advocates are asking is not simply what happened. It is more precise. How much of today's global inequality is downstream from those engineered flows? If European industrial acceleration was partially financed by colonial extraction, then the advantage was not purely domestic ingenuity. It was geopolitical positioning. This does not deny European innovation. It contextualizes it. The African Union's recent emphasis on reparatory justice is not emerging from nostalgia. It emerges from data. Economic historians have quantified patterns of colonial extraction. Scholars have traced how wealth generated in colonies capitalized European banks and industries. Cultural institutions are auditing collections acquired during imperial expansion. The argument is no longer emotional. It is infrastructural. Reparations in this context are not framed as punishment. They are framed as a recalibration of inherited imbalance. Because here is the uncomfortable reality. The global economic order did not start from neutral ground. It began from asymmetry. Some regions industrialized with access to extracted capital. Others entered independence without diversified industrial bases. Time did not neutralize that gap. Debt regimes layered onto it. Post-colonial African states borrowed heavily during the Cold War era. Commodity price crashes in the 1980s triggered debt crises. Structural adjustment programs imposed austerity and privatization. Economic sovereignty narrowed further. From this perspective, reparatory justice is not a backward-looking sentiment. It is a forward-looking correction. If the foundation of global inequality contains structural transfers from one region to another, then ignoring that origin sustains distortion. The reparations movement understands something critical. Before you demand a settlement, you must redefine the frame. The frame is shifting from moral grievance to systemic audit, and audits change negotiations. Africa is not shouting into the void. It is asking a question that global institutions can no longer dismiss easily. If infrastructure in one part of the world was built partly on extracted value from another, does that history carry no structural consequence? The ledger was never formally closed. It was simply assumed to be balanced. Now, the assumption is under review. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. For a long time, reparations lived in the language of protest. Marches, conferences, academic papers, diaspora forums. The moral case was made repeatedly. Slavery was a crime. Colonialism was a crime. Extraction shaped global inequality. Therefore, justice requires redress. The argument was powerful, but power does not shift because something is morally correct. It shifts when morality is institutionalized. That is what is beginning to happen. When the African Union elevated reparatory justice as a continental theme for 2025, it did something strategic. It moved reparations from the margins of activism into the architecture of policy. It signaled that this is not a rhetorical flourish but a coordinated agenda. Discussions around a committee of experts on reparations and the concept of a global reparations fund are not symbolic gestures. They are mechanisms. Mechanisms matter because states do not negotiate emotions. They negotiate frameworks. For decades, Western governments could treat reparations as diffuse and fragmented demands. A Caribbean commission here, a parliamentary motion there, a protest in London, an academic conference in Accra. Fragmentation diluted leverage. Unification changes the equation. When multiple African states align positions, consult legal scholars collectively, coordinate with diaspora networks, and build alliances with bodies like the Caribbean Community CARICOM Reparations Commission, the issue acquires diplomatic weight. It becomes harder to isolate, harder to dismiss. But the strategy emerging is not reckless confrontation, it is calibrated escalation. Reparations advocates understand the legal complexity. Modern international law codified crimes against humanity after World War II. Colonialism predated those conventions. Critics argue that retroactive application is difficult. Yet international law has evolved before under moral pressure. The Nuremberg precedent demonstrated that global consensus can reshape jurisprudence. The point is not to win a courtroom battle tomorrow. It is to shift the normative language today. Norms become policy. Policy becomes leverage. Another layer of strategy lies in reframing reparations beyond compensation. Instead of demanding a single massive transfer, which would trigger immediate political resistance, advocates emphasize multi-dimensional redress, formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, restitution of looted cultural artifacts, cancellation or restructuring of debt linked to colonial economic systems, joint historical commissions, and development financing framed explicitly as corrective rather than charitable. This approach lowers the psychological barrier for Western engagement. Governments resist humiliation. They are more open to partnership. France's willingness to establish a joint commission with Haiti to examine the historical independence ransom reflects this cautious opening. It does not resolve the issue, but it breaks the denial. Once denial breaks, precedent forms. Reparations discourse also intersects with reputational politics. Western nations often present themselves as guardians of international justice. They advocate accountability for human rights violations globally. If domestic publics increasingly question why colonial atrocities remain exempt from serious engagement, political cost rises. Public opinion is not static. Museums across Europe have begun returning artifacts taken during colonial campaigns. Universities are researching their historical ties to slavery. Parliamentary debates on historical responsibility are no longer fringe. Narrative pressure accumulates. Africa's growing geopolitical diversification strengthens this approach. Partnerships with emerging powers reduce vulnerability to diplomatic retaliation. Reduced vulnerability increases negotiation space. The key shift is subtle but decisive. Reparations are no longer framed as a plea. They are framed as a structural conversation about how the modern international system was built and how it might be recalibrated. Leverage is not created overnight. It is constructed patiently. Memory, when organized, becomes leverage, and leverage changes tone. There was a time when raising the question of reparations at the highest diplomatic level would have been dismissed as political theater. The global balance of power was narrow. Financial flows ran in predictable directions. Strategic dependence imposed restraint. That era is fading. The world is no longer arranged along a single axis. China finances rail corridors and ports across Africa. India expands pharmaceutical and technology partnerships. Turkey increases diplomatic missions and defense cooperation. Gulf states invest in logistics, energy, and agriculture. Russia seeks security and political influence. Europe and the United States remain deeply present, but not alone. This diversification does not eliminate dependency. It redistributes it. And redistribution changes negotiation behavior. When options expand, leverage expands. When leverage expands, previously unrealistic conversations become plausible. Reparations discourse benefits from this altered gravitational field. In a unipolar world, challenging historical hierarchies carried higher risk. In a multipolar environment, strategic recalibration becomes part of broader bargaining. Western governments understand that influence is no longer guaranteed. Economic and political partnerships compete. Moral authority competes too. If African states signal that recalibrating historical relationships is part of modern partnership, Western actors must decide whether to shape that recalibration or resist it. This is where the phrase "winning willingly" becomes relevant. Reparations advocates increasingly avoid framing the issue as punitive. Instead, they situate it within future-oriented cooperation. Development financing can be structured as a structural correction. Debt relief can acknowledge historical asymmetry. Trade terms can reflect recognition of inherited imbalances. Cultural restitution can deepen goodwill. None of these actions collapses diplomatic ties. They can strengthen them. The strategic insight is simple: make engagement less threatening than refusal. Western policymakers are attentive to domestic political currents. Younger generations in Europe and North America are more open to confronting colonial history than their predecessors. Cultural institutions face pressure to return artifacts. Universities examine endowments linked to slavery. Activists connect racial justice debates in the West to colonial extraction abroad. The reputational cost of ignoring reparations is increasing incrementally. Meanwhile, Africa's own demographic and economic trajectory adds weight. The continent hosts some of the world's fastest-growing populations and urban centers. Resource endowments remain critical to global energy transitions, including cobalt, lithium, rare earths, and copper. Strategic geography matters for maritime routes and trade corridors. Multipolarity magnifies Africa's importance. Reparations discourse intersects with that importance. It signals that partnership in the 21st century cannot simply replicate 19th century patterns. Empire relied on inevitability, the assumption that hierarchy was natural and permanent. Multipolarity disrupts inevitability. It demonstrates that alignment can shift, influence can rotate, and dependency can diversify. The reparations movement is not about rejecting the West. It is about renegotiating position within a broader system. Western governments face a practical choice: engage constructively and help design frameworks for acknowledgement and recalibration, or resist and risk moral and geopolitical drift. Engagement does not require self-condemnation. It requires adaptation. Adaptation is how international systems evolve. The conversation unfolding now is not explosive. It is administrative. Committees, conferences, research papers, diplomatic communiques. But administration can reshape power as effectively as confrontation. Multipolar gravity has made what once seemed impossible negotiable. Africa is not raising reparations in isolation. It is raising them in a world where alternatives exist, and alternatives alter courage. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Before systems fall, they lose their psychological hold. Colonialism was not sustained by force alone. It was sustained by narrative, the belief that hierarchy was natural, that extraction was development, that domination was civilizing. The economic order that followed independence inherited more than trade routes. It inherited assumptions. One assumption in particular, that the global hierarchy was simply how the world works. Reparations disrupt that assumption. They do something more destabilizing than demanding money. They question legitimacy. They ask whether the foundations of modern global wealth accumulation were neutral or engineered through asymmetry. For decades, many African societies were told that underdevelopment was primarily the result of internal failure, corruption, governance gaps, and instability. Those factors are real, but reparations discourse introduces another variable into the equation: historical architecture. If extraction shaped industrial acceleration elsewhere, then contemporary inequality is not purely domestic mismanagement. It is partly structural inheritance. That distinction changes self-perception. Frantz Fanon wrote that colonialism colonizes the mind before it colonizes land. It implants inferiority as an explanation. When inequality is interpreted as proof of incapacity, resistance weakens. Reparatory justice rejects that interpretation. It asserts that global imbalance is not evidence of civilizational deficiency. It is evidence of historical design. This psychological reversal matters deeply for younger African generations. They are growing up in a world where information is less filtered. They can trace mining concessions. They can track resource flows. They can examine colonial borders and economic patterns with clarity. The narrative of inevitability is harder to sustain, and when inevitability erodes, agency strengthens. Reparations, therefore, are not only diplomatic tools, they are internal signals. When African governments speak of reparatory justice at continental forums, they communicate to their citizens that history is not closed, that power can be renegotiated, and that structural constraints are not sacred. This does not absolve internal governance failures. It does not excuse corruption or policy mistakes. But it widens the analytical frame. It prevents a reductionist explanation of inequality. On the Western side, the psychological shift is equally significant. European and North American societies have confronted their own histories in selective ways. War crimes within Europe were prosecuted. Financial settlements were calculated. Time did not invalidate those obligations. Yet colonial extraction often occupies a different moral category, acknowledged in museums, compartmentalized in textbooks, but rarely integrated into contemporary economic discussion. Reparations discourse challenges that compartmentalization. It asks why one set of historical injustices triggers a structured settlement while another remains symbolically recognized but materially untouched. This comparison is uncomfortable. But discomfort is often the precursor to policy evolution. As museums return artifacts, as academic research quantifies colonial profits, and as parliamentary debates surface historical accountability, the psychological distance between past and present narrows. Reparations guarantee scrutiny, and scrutiny reshapes legitimacy. The empire once depended on the belief that hierarchy was permanent. The reparations movement does not topple hierarchy overnight, but it weakens its moral armor. It introduces doubt into the inevitability narrative, and doubt is powerful, because when people believe structures can change, they begin to negotiate differently, both externally and internally. The psychological reversal may be the quiet engine behind everything else. Money can shift balance sheets, but belief shifts eras. And across Africa, belief is changing. Reparations will not arrive with a dramatic ceremony. There will be no grand signing under chandeliers where centuries are suddenly resolved in a single moment. If this shift succeeds, it will look incremental, quiet, procedural, almost technical. And that is precisely why it matters. Global systems rarely collapse. They adjust. If reparatory justice becomes embedded in diplomatic language, it will first appear in small phrases. A communiqué acknowledging historical asymmetry. A development agreement referencing a structural imbalance. A debt restructuring framed not only as fiscal relief but as recognition of inherited distortion. A joint commission is studying the colonial economic impact. Another museum quietly returns artifacts without litigation. Each action will seem modest in isolation. Together they redraw the ledger. For over a century, the international economic order functioned on the assumption that starting positions were irrelevant, that whatever disparities existed at independence were simply the new baseline. Countries entered the global market from radically unequal historical positions. Some industrialized through accumulated colonial capital, others commodity-dependent because that structure had been engineered for them. The system treated those starting points as neutral. The reparations challenged neutrality. If the global economy were scaffolded by extraction, then fairness in the present cannot ignore origin. That does not require dismantling trade or rewriting history with resentment. It requires integrating origin into negotiation. Western governments face a strategic reality. Engagement on reparatory justice may be politically delicate, but resistance carries a cost. The more global discourse links human rights credibility to historical accountability, the more selective memory becomes reputationally expensive. And reputational power matters in diplomacy. A Europe that engages constructively can help shape frameworks for recalibration, joint funds, structured debt adjustments, and investment initiatives tied explicitly to historical acknowledgement. A Europe that resists risks reinforces the perception that accountability is conditional. The United States confronts a parallel dynamic. Its global leadership claims often rest on moral positioning. Ignoring the transatlantic slave trade's structural consequences while advocating justice elsewhere invites contradiction. This is not about moral condemnation. It is about coherence. Africa, however, carries responsibility as well. Reparations cannot substitute internal reform. Structural redress does not eliminate governance obligations. If new leverage is gained, it must be managed wisely. Unity across the continent must be sustained. Negotiations must avoid fragmentation. Transparency must accompany any framework that emerges. Reparatory justice is not a blank check. It is a recalibration tool. The deeper question is this: what does a mature global order look like? Is it one that treats history as museum content, preserved but disconnected from policy? Or one that integrates historical origin into contemporary economic reasoning? The reparations discourse pushes toward the latter. It does not guarantee a financial windfall. It guarantees that the foundation of global inequality is no longer exempt from examination. That alone alters the atmosphere of negotiation. 2 centuries ago, coercion enforced an invoice. Today, coordination reopens the account. The difference is profound. In 1825, power dictated terms from offshore warships. In 2026, power is negotiated through institutions, legal language, demographic gravity, and strategic alignment. History does not reverse itself neatly, but it evolves. If reparations take root within diplomatic practice, even incrementally, the effect will extend beyond Africa. It will influence how international law treats historical harm globally. It will test whether moral evolution can translate into structural adjustment. The ledger is not a metaphor anymore. It is a framework under review. And when frameworks shift, eras follow. Africa is not asking to be saved. It is asking whether the global order is ready to reconcile itself. So, let us know in the comments section. Will the West pay back? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.